Well, good morning everyone, or afternoon, I'm not sure which one it is now. Thank you to Marcus Evans for putting on such a great 2 days, and it's a real privilege to be able to come down here and to talk about something that's of interest to me. To introduce where I come from, this is the plant that I work at, QMP, which is a joint venture between CSBP and Dyno, so Wesfarmers and Incitec Pivot. So we're a small plant. We produce about 20% of the ammonium nitrate that's used in central Queensland. As you can see, not a lot of risk there of urban encroachment out in the middle of nowhere, although we do have a little bit of mining encroachment, and we're wondering when they're going to ask us to move because we're under the coal deposit. So just to give you a bit of context of where that is, it's about 1,800 kilometres north of here. It's 200 kilometres west of Gladstone and about 700 kilometres drive from Brisbane. So it's fairly remote. So what's in it for me? Why am I doing this presentation? Well, as I guess most of you experience, we have to talk about ALARP, or its grammatical twin, SAFARP. It's an important part of things we need to demonstrate in our safety case. And so we're a bit isolated, as I explained, out in the middle of nowhere. It's very useful for me to present some of the ideas, some of the things we do, some of the things we're thinking, and to get feedback from other people to see what you're doing, to make sure that we're not straying too far off the path, and to see whether we can improve some of the things we do. So I'm not trying to suggest what I say is the be-all or the end-all about ALARP or SAFARP, but these are some of the things that we've discovered. We're going to first look at what the law says about SAFARP. We have to start there, that's where it's defined. We're going to think about our systems and see whether the argument that we use to say we're SAFARP, whether our systems are actually sufficient to mean that decision or that assessment is reliable. How do we know that that's actually true? What are our best options for improving risk? We've found this one to be a complicated subject and difficult to get our heads around, so we'll look at some examples there. And then finally, how do we actually determine what must be done? And we've found some traps in there that we'll talk about as well. And then finally, do we want to be leaders or followers? So let's first take a look at the law. If you go to the Model Act and you go to sections and definitions, it will define for you what SAFARP is, or reasonably practical. Well, actually, no, it just says go to section 18. Section 18 says this, and I'm not sure what you think, but if you read that carefully, I think it says reasonably practicable is reasonably practicable. That's what I got out of that. There's an interesting bit to this, though, that I think is significant, is the section which says means that which is or was at a particular time. So it's not just what is reasonably practicable, it's what was reasonably practicable at a point in time. So the question I'll ask, let's say you have two controls that you've assessed, they're feasible, you've done the analysis and they're both reasonably practicable. So you say, well, as a good manager would, you'd say, well, I'll do the cheapest one. So you implement the cheapest one, and then you reassess the other one, and it's no longer reasonably practicable. My question is, what do you think? Have you fulfilled your duty, or have you not fulfilled your duty? Because when you started, they were both reasonably practicable. Anyone game to offer an opinion?
Depends on how far off the cost is, because if it's grossly disproportionate, then it's not.
Well, they both started off as not being grossly disproportionate. Sorry? Anyway, we'll have a look at that later. I think it's an important question we need to think through. Section 18 says this. So the first, I guess, A to D is looking at your risk and trying to see how you can improve it. So your A to B, that's your typical risk assessment. C is then, I guess, telling us it's not about what you know. This is about what you should know, and that you have to put the effort in to find it out even if you don't. So it doesn't say what you think you should know or what you do know. It's maybe, if it's an engineering thing, if you went out and hired a competent engineer in this field, what would that person tell you needed to do? Or what would they know? Or what could they find out if they put a decent effort into having a look? And then you have to assess whether they're, for your circumstances, available or suitable, because they may not be suitable for you. And then after that, you have to assess whether or not the cost is disproportionate to the benefit. Important word there is the after. I think it's very tempting for us to jump ahead and look at the cost and then, or maybe even what we have to spend, and to see what we can do with it. The law actually requires you to do A to D first, and then you look at the cost. If you do it the other way around, then you're actually not following what you're required here. Now, another question. You read this. This is the definition of reasonably practicable. What do you think about this in terms of the quality of definition? Anyone game to offer another opinion? Well, my opinion is this is not a definition. There's no objective measure by which to determine from this whether something is reasonably practicable or not. In fact, I think this is a process, not a definition. Am I making sense? Yeah. Because there is no objective way of determining, once you've gone through this process, of whether you actually got there or not, or whether something is reasonably practicable or whether it's not reasonably practicable. It simply does not tell you. Interestingly though, reasonably practicable is measured objectively. And that means that you don't have to meet a different standard to someone who's across the fence. It's measured the same way. You have to meet the same standard. Safe Work explains this in terms of capacity to pay. Capacity to pay is irrelevant. If you can't afford to do what you need to do to make something that's reasonably practicable, then essentially you have to stop doing what you're doing. Now, one thing they don't mention, which I think is equally as important, is just because you're making a lot of money doesn't mean you have to meet a higher standard by law than someone who isn't. So you're not required to meet a higher standard than other duty holders simply because you have the greater capacity to pay. It's an objective standard. Even though we don't actually know what we measure that with, it is still objective. HSEU guidance gives us a bit of an idea what this gross disproportionate thing is. So a couple of different factors that they use in different circumstances. So if you look at a bit of a graph, apparently if it's low risk to the public, a factor of 2. So the cost must be up to 2 times the benefit. Presumably that means we're not really talking about fatality risks or things that are very infrequent. Workers, you need to apply a higher gross disproportionate factor, which implies that workers are more valuable than the public. I'm not sure the public would agree. And then if you're high risk, they give a factor of 10. And for Q&P, we make ammonium nitrate. My desk is about a kilometre inside the 20% blast radius of fatalities. It's a bit hard to argue that it's not high risk. And so we've adopted a disproportionate factor of 10. HSE UK also produces some very useful guidance explaining these concepts. And so there is a point at which your risk is not tolerable. 10 to the minus 3 for workers and 10 to the minus 4 for public. Seems to be the other way around. They explain the concept of needing to have the cost grossly disproportionate. If it's not, you have to make the improvement. The interesting difference is this one here. They suggest that if the risk is quite low, you don't have to have disproportionality. The law doesn't allow that in the Model Act. It has to be, regardless of the risk, grossly disproportionate. So we can't apply that in Australia. At the bottom you have the broadly acceptable region. You don't need to do detailed working, and you can actually demonstrate using maths that that's actually true, but you still do have to demonstrate. It's somewhere where you have to get to, and you have to be able to show that you're there, even if you don't do complicated working for your much lower risks. And then of course you need to be able to demonstrate that even if you have arrived there for a particular risk, that you've actually got programs in place that allow you to stay there. So I'll add the personal bit. We do ALARP in our own lives all the time, and we just don't recognise it. So this is a photo of my wife Katura and our first child, Serafina, when she was 1 day old. I reckon Katura looks pretty good for 1 day after giving birth. Now we had a bit of a challenge because we live out in the middle of nowhere in a little town called Billawheeler. Has a great hospital. Midwives ranked at the top of all the midwives in the region, so ticks the boxes for having your first child. We did have a problem though, that the doctors are a little bit skittish. So any complications, they're liable to put any lady that's in labour in an ambulance and ship them off to Rockhampton. So that's about 2 hours along a bumpy road. Not a lot of fun when you've just gone into labour. We talked to a few people around, and the word we got back was that if it was your first pregnancy, there was a likelihood the doctors would consider that a complication and that you'd get just stuck straight into the ambulance. So we thought, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. The other thing is it is a small hospital. You don't have all the specialists there, you don't have all the good gear. Probably won't matter, but if something goes wrong, then you're going to need that stuff. Do you want to take the risk? The low risk perhaps, that if something goes wrong you don't have the things you need there when you need them. And the thing that really struck it home to me was well, what do you do to someone who's in the middle of labour? It's not going so well, you don't have the gear or the specialists, what do you do? Oh, we airlift them to Rockhampton. So you're in the middle of labour, it's going so badly you need to go to another hospital, you're going to drive them out to the airport, put them on a plane, fly them to Rockhampton. I'm like, no. Funnily enough, Katura was more okay with that than I was. I was like, no way, I'm not taking that risk. And so we decided that we would go to a hospital in Rockhampton. So what we did is we literally moved house, rented an apartment it ended up being 3 weeks before the due date, and lived there. And then I commuted 2 days and then 1 day off and then 2 days to work. Because we figured I could get back for the birth if she went into labour, and that 2 weeks, and it turned out to be 3, was enough to mitigate that risk. It ended up being a month because she was a week overdue. So we spent a bit of time in Gracemere near Rocky. And so we rejected the idea of doing it at Billow. Rockhampton was an acceptable solution. We looked at Brisbane, better hospitals, better specialists, but a lot further away. If I tried to work, she might have the birth and I wouldn't be there. I didn't want that. I might be tempted to drive to Brisbane a little bit too fast. That put me at risk. If I took leave, then I'd have to use up my leave. And so we rejected Brisbane as an option as well. And also because we'd have to drive back 7 hours driving with a newborn child. And we thought, maybe we don't want to do that either. And so that we went through a process of determining what was reasonable to do in that circumstance. Brisbane we rejected, even though it had some positive things to it and had a few negatives. Billawheeler we discarded because it just wasn't acceptable. We couldn't accept the risk that it presented, but Rockhampton was okay, and so we chose that. And so if anyone wanted to know what ALAP was, that's the best exclamation I can give you. I think the other thing is, some risks cannot be quantified with money. If you said to me, well, what dollar value are you willing to put on the risk of your wife being put on a plane when she's in the middle of labour and it's going badly? How many dollars would you assign to that risk? No, I don't want to accept that risk. I'm not going to put a dollar value on that. So a question for us, what stage are we at? I'll get back to you on that. You're starting to think about that, you really don't know. Much to do, working on getting it done. I know 10 years ago QMP was very much at that stage. We had a risk assessment. We were aware of we needed to improve. It was a little bit patchy. We had a long list of things to do. We weren't actually doing assessment about whether it was reasonably practical because we knew we could do them, and we were just getting on and trying to do them.
With orange stickers.
Yeah, I've got that.
I'd say we're about number 3, so we have projects which we've identified that we know we can do. And we're working hard to justify more. It's getting harder and harder to put forward the justification.
Without the stickers, the food is in the foil.
That's when you're getting to the stage where I think that you're getting to the stage of where you really are getting your risk down to the level where you can say maybe, well, it is ALARP, or getting close. And finally, 4, are you getting creative, or do you need to get creative to justify these improvements? Do you have to combine them with other risks that a control might actually help with? Are you looking at production and cost and reputation to absorb some of the cost to justify it? Maybe you've got to the stage where you just say, well, we're going to budget a certain amount to this, whether we think it's justified or not. We're going to just continue doing improvement projects because we think it's a good thing to do. Or maybe you just up your, or decrease your risk tolerance. So the question is, are we making decisions based on reliable information? It's certainly something that was challenged to us when we had our last licence review. They said, well, rubbish in, rubbish out. You might have a good ALARP argument, but if your systems are terrible, then how do we know that's true? So I think you have to build it up from the bottom. It's a bit like building a house. You need to know what your risks are. And this is from a perspective of, let's say you're building a new facility. You have to understand what the risk categories are that you're going to introduce by doing this new project. You need to develop the safety management system detail that says these are the things that we need to do. We need a permit to work system, and this is what it has to have in it. We need a management of change system, and this is what a change is, and this is the sorts of things it needs to have in it. And this ensures you've got a fit for purpose SMS. You need to implement the SMS. You need to write the programs, you need to implement and do them, and you need to continuously review and improve them. And so it's not much good just having an SMS that's fit for the purpose if you don't do it. You have to then do it. And then on top of this, you're doing your identification of MAEs. In fact, you may have done that as part of the SMS implementation. And so we call it a systematic risk assessment. We use the LOPA methodology for this. You then have to identify future controls for each of those. And then you need to determine which of those are reasonably practical, which are the ones you can do, and then which ones are not grossly disproportionate. And that ensures your risk and improvement options are understood, quantified, and you've got projects in place to improve things. Chance would have it, a picture went up in the last presentation that describes this. You don't want this tower looking like you've been playing Jenga for an hour. It needs to be that Jenga stack before you've started playing the game. Because otherwise you'll never be able to demonstrate that you're ALARP, because your systems aren't working. And then of course you have to be implementing these reasonably practical improvements. And that's your minimum standard. That's what the law says we have to do. That's a compliance obligation. And of course you have to continually work on that. So for us, this is a process that we use for continuous improvement. So we identify our major accident events, we risk assess them using bow tie LOPA methodology, we identify the feasible future controls, and then we calculate the benefit of those controls where we can, and then we calculate the cost benefit of that, and then we implement the future controls in order of best cost benefit as resources allow. So that's a bit of information on each of those stages. You're required to do that every 5 years, as the regulation said. Most of this top section is actually led by the process safety engineer. We have another group that reviews particularly the top risks to see what the opportunities are for improvement, and because they're the ones with the ability to authorise those. And then we budget these things as per the normal processes. So when it comes to achieving ALARP, this is the same flowchart. Here we check to see whether the cost is 10 times the benefit for each control. If it is, then that risk is ALARP. It doesn't mean everything is, but at that point in time, that risk is ALARP. If it's not, we implement controls with the greatest benefit, and then we double check. And then we keep on going around until the risk is ALARP for every risk. So the ALARP is achieved when all reasonably practical future controls have been implemented. In other words, all future controls are grossly disproportionate or greater than 10 times the benefit. Or, if you're in our situation now, when all the future controls that need to be implemented are identified and they're proceeding as fast as reasonably practicable. Because one thing that we have challenges with, and I'm sure you all do, is resourcing. It's not necessarily just the money, it's the people and the expertise to actually get this stuff done. You just can't click your fingers one day and have all these things done. So let's do some calculations. We're all mostly technical people here, aren't we? You like doing calculations? So this is an example. We use the value of life that HSC guidance gives as a benchmark. For continuous improvement, that number is actually irrelevant. So, you know, it could be 5, it could be 7. I think the rail uses something around 7. It could be 10. It doesn't actually matter that much. We use 20 years as a plant life again. These partly because it gives us easy maths. It gives you a number of 10 to the 8 to use. So an example that recently came up for us, and again coincidentally the flow diagram for this was put up yesterday. We actually implemented a secondary air compressor that puts air into the bottom of our absorption column, which reacts NOx gases with water to make nitric acid. If this trips, the gas from that absorption column can come back through the compressor and into the air, and it's quite toxic. So that can definitely cause fatalities. So we're looking at putting a trip valve on that. So if the secondary air compressor trips, it would close the valve, and the risk reduction it gives us is 5 by 10 to the minus 4. And so that gives us, based on this reasoning, a benefit of $50,000. Cost is roughly 150, which is 3 times the benefit. And so, in fact, this is worth doing. There's an alternate view of looking at that, is saying your maximum spend is $500,000. 50 times your gross disproportionate factor of 10. So I thought I would do a little bit of an activity. So I do need some participation here. I just need you to yell out no or do or not do. You reckon you can do that? All right. So we have a bow tie here. We have the black one is the best proposed control that you want to do. It's got a PFD, probability of failure and demand of 0.1. It'll give you that risk reduction, which gives you this benefit, and it's going to cost you $10,000. So what do you reckon? Shall we do it or shall we not do it? Do. All right. I reckon you should do that one. The engineer goes off and has a bit of a closer look at it because, you know, you hadn't done all your engineering design at this point, and says, you know what, I've discovered something, this control won't work for B. But good news is it still works for A. The risk reduction's gone down a bit. Benefit's now $900. Your cost is $10,000 and your cost benefit is $11,000. What do you reckon? Shall we do? Or shall we not do? Enough to know that it won't work for B, so you've probably not got to your final design yet. You're suggesting this because all your engineering costs will be in the design, so you've already spent $9,000, is it? So it would seem not do, but I would challenge you to ask a few questions about this. You say, have you really considered all the benefits? You might note that you've got an explosion. I've just done the calculation on the fatality risk and the benefit from not having the fatality. What about the vessel that you no longer have and you have to replace? What about the downtime of production? Have you included those? Maybe your improvement will have other benefits like reducing the cost of something else you might want to do. And is it worth doing because of continuous improvement? Is it actually the best thing you have right now to improve? So maybe you'd still do it anyway. All right, this one's simpler. So you've got a new bow tie, something new you're going to do, and you've identified 4 feasible controls, and I've given you the PFDs there, and they're combined for all of them. So, what's your opinion? Which of the proposed controls should you give preference to? What sorts of things would you think about when you're choosing which ones to do? Why?
The control side rather than the mitigation side. Not the mitigation,
Yeah.
really effective.
So, stopping the explosion and having your controls on the bit that stops you getting there is a very good idea. I would say that.
So W, X, Y and Z all combined obviously give you great preventative scenarios, but may end up being out of your range from a cost perspective because of the amount that you have to do. So X by itself, W by itself gets you fairly close to that. So if you just got a little bit of singular control, then consider that.
Yeah, so they're good ideas. You know, the ones that give you the biggest risk reduction, you know, that's a good idea. The ones that stop you having an explosion, that's also a good idea. Maybe though you'd say, well, maybe there's a bit of extra resilience in diversity, and so maybe we'll do X and Z instead of W because it gives us the same reduction, but more controls. Maybe there's some benefit to that. But the downside is, of course, Z's on the other side of the explosion, and you're probably not going to be keen on that. So now I've given you a bit of extra information. So what do you reckon we're going to do now? What would you recommend to management now from all these controls? Where do we start? We can take a vote. Who says W? Yeah, we have a W, a few of those. Who says X? Yeah, a few people like X. Anyone think Y? I'm not taking photos, so I won't hold you to this. And then anyone thinks Z? So no one will start with Z, I think. All right. Well, you take it to your manager, and managers are trained. It's an important part of their job to efficiently allocate capital. So they've looked at this and said the best cost benefit is Y, and so we will do Y first. Okay, so let's do that. So you've done Y, you've redone your analysis, and now you have this information. So what do we do now? X? Is that a unanimous opinion? We'll do X? Yep, well, it seems pretty sensible to me. Maybe X and Z. You know, it comes out as 10. Now I'll give you all the information. What do you think we should have done? The green bit kind of gives it away. You know. If you look at everything, and if you had analysed all the options prior to doing anything, you will then understand which combinations actually are reasonably practicable based on the cost-benefit ratios. So anything 10 or below are effectively things that you would consider reasonably practicable to do. If you just jump in the first one that has the best cost-benefit ratio, it's going to lead you down a path where you actually get a much lower risk reduction. So I think we eventually said Y and X, or it could have been Y and Z, or maybe X, Y and Z. So we would have ended up here, at 5 by 10 to the minus 7 at the best, which is a 5 times higher risk than if we had have gone straight to W and X. And in fact, we ruled out Y after doing, ruled out W after doing Y, whereas it's clearly reasonably practicable. And so I think that it's a really big trap, particularly when you're talking to managers who do think very much on, efficiently applying their money. The cost-benefit ratio tells you whether it's reasonably practicable. The things you need to do are the ones that reduce the risk so far as reasonably practicable. So the cost-benefit guides you as to which ones are worth doing and which ones are not, but you have to think about what the final risk will be to make the decision. So you've got to be really careful about making decisions around cost-benefit ratios. So this is your house. What happens when you've achieved ALARP? Well, that's where you get into the continuous improvement zone. And I think it's important for us to remember that ALARP is a minimum standard. It's a regulatory obligation. It's an externally imposed standard. We shouldn't think of it as something that we're tied to. Once you got to ALARP, then you can stop doing anything because that standard is all you have to do. In fact, I think continuous improvement is what we should be focusing on, and that should be our normal operation. It was an interesting comment at the end of the last seminar that reminded me of a story someone told a couple of weeks ago about, I think it was the Brisbane Bears, and they did a study on the Brisbane Bears and said, what was it that meant you could keep winning after a successful year? Because often teams have a terrible year after winning the grand final or something like this. What kept you going at top performance? And what they found was people didn't want, or members of the team didn't want to be the one person that let the team down. They didn't want to be the one that caused the next loss. And thinking about that statement, 20 years without a major incident, it's good that we've had that 20 years. And the question is, what drives us on? And I think, well, for me, I don't want to be the person that lets the whole industry down, and certainly not my family. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, if you stay here, we do actually have time for a couple of questions. I'll let you read it and you can.
I would tend to say that where you can do it, it's very useful to do. You can do it for almost everything. I've done it for spider bite and snake bite. I think you've got to ask the question whether there's really a benefit for doing it. The ones that we find most useful are our higher risks, which tend to be your larger major accident events where there's fatalities and multiple fatalities. When you're getting down to ones where there's injuries and that sort of thing, you're probably getting down to much lower risks compared to your typical process safety event, and you probably don't want to go to all the effort to do that. Even a lot of our process safety events, the risk is so low that it's just not worth doing the cost-benefit analysis or even documenting it, because you can literally do it in your head. Once you get to 10 to the minus 6 using a gross disproportionate factor, I think you've got $1,000 to spend. Often you'll spend more than that just thinking about it in terms of time. So once you're getting to those risks, the 10 to the minus 7, 10 to the minus 8, you really don't. You can do all the analysis, but all you're going to find out is you didn't have the money to spend on that anyway. So. Yep.
How do you find the regulator's response to cost-benefit analysis, given that it's not specifically written in our legislation?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I I joke that I kept the regulator back from remedial classes during our licence audit. We had lengthy discussions on this. The simple fact is, cost-benefit analysis is mandated in Queensland law. It's in the model regulations. When it says this is what's reasonably practical, you must do these things, basically. And cost-benefit analysis, gross disproportionate calculations, and whether that's financial or some other way, I guess is not the point. But you have to do that, because it says you must do all these things, and after that you must look at the cost and compare it to the benefit and see whether these things are, and balance them up, and you have to make those difficult decisions about whether this is worth doing or not. And our experience was the regulator didn't really like that idea. And so it was a bit of a struggle, because I'm saying we're doing this for one reason, and that is because the law requires us to, and you're telling us you don't like us doing it. So, rock in a hard place. We're going to continue doing this, whether this form or another form, if there's a better way of doing it. But the law requires us to do it. So, sure, you can say, well, we don't like your emphasis on cost-benefit analysis. We disagree.
Yep. Question at the back.
You include your operating costs in your cost benefit analysis. So if you have to implement a new trip or change the sill level. Or change the sill level for a trip, it's obviously going to have ongoing costs. Do you account for that, and does that often throw you back over your 10?
It's a good question. A lot of the projects that we do the cost benefit analysis for are largely capital. But yeah, when it comes to procedures, we will look at that, particularly things where you do need to maintain them. We don't do it for everything, but it is something that I would like to be doing more often, particularly for those things where you've got a lot of maintenance. I think you have to be a little bit careful though, because trip testing, for example, you already do a lot of trip testing, you've already got systems in place to do it. What is the actual cost for trip testing? You just want to be a bit careful that you don't put too much value on that.
Hi, Stephen. Just following on from that, but maybe about the complexity, and that adding extra controls adds complexity in the human factors analysis. Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell us about how you do that at your site?
Yeah, so it really does depend on what you're looking at. So in terms of improvement, we try to shy away from just saying, here's a procedure we can improve. I guess when I put Y up there, I was thinking, the 0.5 PFD, that's probably a procedure, and that's why it's so cheap. It'll only cost us a bit of money to do a bit more training on that or make it a bit better. And I would tend to shy away from relying on those things in our risk analysis. So we tend to try and prefer those things that are permanent changes that actually do give you a significant change in risk. If it's worth reducing the risk for something, then you may as well get it off that list so it doesn't ever appear again, and you can then concentrate on other things.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephen.